Mr. President.
The Senator for Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Trump has been in Vietnam this week meeting with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. I applaud the President for his efforts to improve the U.S. relationship with North Korea. There's not a more difficult relationship anywhere in the world at this time than that relationship. But I'm glad he chose not to seek a deal just for the sake of a deal. But as he returns from his summit with the North Korean leader and turns his attention back home, I want to make a respectful suggestion, and that is this: that President Trump ask his lawyers to take a second look at an existing funding authorities that the President has to consider construction of the 234 miles of border wall that do not require a formal declaration of a national emergency. I support what the President wants to do on border security, but I do not support the way he has been advised to do it. It is unnecessary and unwise to turn a border crisis into a constitutional crisis about separation of powers when the President already has congressional funding authority to build the 234 miles of border wall that he requested in his January 6th letter to the Senate. I ask consent to include in the record following my remarks the text of the President's January 6th letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there has never been an instance where a President of the United States has asked for funding, Congress has refused it, and the President has then used the National Emergency Act to justify spending the money anyway. If President Trump can build a wall when Congress has refused to provide the funding, then the next president can declare a national emergency and tear the wall down, or declare climate change an emergency and stop oil exports and offshore drilling. There's no limit to the imagination of what the next left-wing president could do to harm our country with this precedent. After an American revolution against a king, our founders chose not to create a chief executive who could tax the people and spend their money any way he chose. The Constitution gave that responsibility exclusively to a Congress elected by the people. And every one of us United States senators has taken an oath to support that Constitution. Separation of powers is a crucial constitutional imperative that goes to the very heart of our freedom. I don't know how the late Justice Antonin Scalia would have decided a case on this matter, but I do know what he said about separation of power. And this was what Justice Scalia said. Every tin-horn dictator, the justice said, every tin-horn dictator in the world today has a Bill of Rights. That's not what makes us free. What has made us free is our Constitution. The word Constitution means structure. That's why the framers debated not the Bill of Rights, but rather the structure of the federal government. The genius of the American constitutional system, Justice Scalia said, is the dispersal of power. Once power is centralized in one person or one part of our government, the Bill of Rights is just words on paper. That's Justice Scalia. The President can avoid this dangerous precedent completely. He can use the congressional funding authority he already has to build the 234 miles of wall that he asked Congress to approve in the January 6th letter that I submitted for the record. Here is how this would work. On January 6th of this year, last month, in his letter to the Senate Appropriations Committee, the President requested $5.7 billion to build 234 miles of new physical barrier on the southern border. Then on February 14, a couple of weeks ago, Congress passed the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, which provided $1.375 billion to build 55 miles that the President had asked for. On February 15, the day he signed the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, President Trump announced that he would use two additional sources of funds that had already been approved by Congress, which could be used to fund the border wall. The first was $601 million from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund. The second was up to $2.5 billion from the Department of Defense accounts to support counter-drug activities and to block drug smuggling corridors across international boundaries. The President is authorized to do this because of a provision in law that allows him to transfer up to $4 billion among the accounts of the Department of Defense. That's $4 billion in a Department of Defense budget of about $600 billion. These three sources of funding that I just mentioned add up to about $4.5 billion, or $1.2 billion less than the $5.7 billion that the President requested in his January 6 letter. So where does he get the rest of the money? He can get it by transferring $3.7 billion instead of $2.5 billion from the Department of Defense accounts to support counter-drug activities. Then the President would be able to build the 234 miles of wall he requested on January 6, and he would not need to declare a national emergency. To be specific, this means the President would use $1.375 billion from the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill, plus $601 million from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund, plus $3.7 billion from the Departments of Defense accounts to support counter-drug activities, which would add up to equal his full $5.7 billion request to build 234 miles of border wall. If my analysis is incorrect, Mr. President, I hope that the President's lawyers will tell me. Using funds already approved by Congress avoids the constitutional crisis of separation of powers. Using funds already approved by Congress avoids establishing a dangerous precedent, which could be misused by subsequent presidents. Using funds already approved by Congress avoids taking money from military construction projects specifically approved by Congress for such activities as military barracks and hospitals. And using funds already approved by Congress avoids months or years of litigation which could make it unlikely that the full 234 miles are ever built. Mr. President, it may be a couple of weeks before the Senate votes on a resolution regarding the national emergency declaration. So we don't know yet exactly what we'll be voting on. There is time for the President's lawyers to take another look and determine whether we can both build the 234 miles of border wall that the President has requested and avoid this dangerous precedent. Then the Senate could both support the President's border request and be faithful to our oath to support a Constitution that creates separation of powers as a crucial check on executive power that goes to the very heart of our freedom. I thank the President, and I yield the floor. I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.